It's been a very interesting time to be teaching at a school of journalism in an age of Trump. And in fact, last year, a number of us were so concerned, not just about issues around fake news and the kind of atmosphere that we're living in these days, even those of us north of the border, that we actually had an old-fashioned teach-in. We took a day off, we canceled all the classes, and we had a day of seminars and discussions about what it means to do journalism in this day and age. And part of that definitely had to do with fake news. It's an exciting time, but it's a challenging time too because of the kind of way in which people think about journalism and journalists as well. So, a number of surveys will show that the opinion of people towards journalism and journalists is quite low, which is difficult when you're especially training people to go into this profession. So it's exciting to talk about fake news with you, but also I hope to encourage you to think a little bit about what it means to be a consumer of news. So trying to put the emphasis and the onus tonight on thinking about what can we do when it comes to issues around truth and news and journalism. And I'm going to approach it, as I think is hopefully appropriate, thinking about some kind of religious ways, church teachings that I think can be helpful filters through which to think about these issues. So I'm gonna chat about some of these issues, and I'm really looking forward to addressing and hearing what you come up with the small group questions. And please feel free, as said, to make notes as to the things that I didn't cover or you'd like to know more about. So the first thing I think is really important is precision in language. So what do we mean when we talk about fake news? And I have a feeling that in this room probably there are a number of different ways in which people may think about fake news. So the first thing is to recognize how it's been co-opted as a way of talking about news that people just don't like, right? And again, it's very hard for me to talk about this subject without mentioning the name of Mr. Trump, but he's the chief person now who any kind of news that he finds runs counter to what he's interested in or goes against his agenda immediately gets called fake news. And we've seen it happening here in Canada as well. So that's the first thing it is not. Okay? Fake news is not just some kind of news that somebody doesn't like. All right? So that's the first thing. The other thing that I think is important to differentiate is it's not satire. All right? How many of you would say that you're fans of The Onion? Okay? Or The Beaverton? Or the old Stephen Colbert Show? Or any number of satirical, like This Hour's 22 Minutes. Let's have some good Canadian examples too. So satire, and for those of you who have studied literature and a modest proposal that goes all the way back to that sort of thing, that has a really important place in terms of rhetorical devices to get people to think about things and challenge them by coming across like something that's real, right? Using the strategies of news reporting to be satirical, to make fun of something. But generally speaking, most people recognize that. They'll see on the URL The Onion and they go, oh yeah, that was really good, that was really funny. But it's not fake news. Satire is not fake news, okay? It's also not fake news when a journalist makes a mistake, all right? And that happens. That happens for all sorts of reasons. It's one of the worst things that can happen to a journalist because all we have at the end of the day is our reputation. And our reputation is based on truth. So journalists almost will go out of their way not to make a mistake. But when we do make a mistake, we have to correct it. And that's just another part of the job, very, very important. I think there's been an erosion of trust in real journalism with some very high-profile cases, like Jason Blair at the New York Times, who did just make up news, faked interviews, used other people's reporting, had front page reports that went across that he completely fabricated. And when that happens at a place like the New York Times, I think that definitely erodes trust and makes people, feel much more cynical about news. But that's not fake news. That's bad reporting. That may be unethical. But that's not fake news. Fake news is where somebody makes up a story with a motive. Okay? So in order to undercut, in order to cheapen, in order to hurt the reputation of someone, that is fake news. Okay? Intention matters here. Very, very important. And we've seen that particularly around election times with fake news. When it really counts, people actually just making up stories and getting them out there. And I think as we see proceedings in the US going on, we're going to learn a lot more about fake news. We're already starting to learn a little bit more about how news was provided through social media, like Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's helping people understand a little bit more about what fake news is. So in your discussions and in your thinking, I hope you think a little bit about what fake news actually is, and also sometimes where there's a bit of bleed between one form and the other, and how there's a lot of dialogue around how late night comics and hosts are becoming some of the sources for people's understanding of the news, particularly for politics, which is good if it increases the reach, but there are people who also feel that it somewhat cheapens or undercuts traditional news as well, because they're using the forms of news to be ironic and satirical. So that's important too. Why should citizens care about fake news, and why should Christians care in particular? Obviously, the most important thing is the truth, right? And we spend a lot of our time talking about truth and thinking about truth. And how it relates to both individuals and groups who are covered by journalism. So I don't know if any of you don't have to raise your hand and out yourself here, but have had the experience of having your name appear in a publication or on radio or something, and you're like, I didn't say that to the journalist. That's not what I said. Or they spelled my name wrong, I can't believe that. Or they misidentified me in the photograph, was right to left, not left to right, and I don't look like that person, that's for sure. So, until you've had that experience, you may not fully appreciate what it's like. I was speaking with my students the other day about what it's like to read a story about a loved one who's died, or even an acquaintance who's died, and how bracing and weird it is to have them described in a very matter-of-fact news report way. One of my students had an acquaintance who was murdered. We were talking about this in class. And that's when you start to realize how important it is for journalists to get it right? Not to make mistakes in the facts, and to get basic things like people's names right and their age right and all sorts of really basic things. And I think, unfortunately, it's not until you've had that experience of having yourself or someone you love or care about misrepresented that you start to realize just how important it is for things to be true. The little details matter, and even this most smallest insignificant story, somebody reporting on a softball league and a 7-year-old's name being misspelled, that matters. That matters to the 7-year-old and to the parents and everybody else. So the truth is really, really important. It's important for an individual, but it's also very important for people and communities, groups, where people are being identified within groups of any kind, and the majority of people still rely on mass media for information, not only about their own groups, but also people who would identify as being outside of those groups. And obviously we all have kind of overlapping bubbles of groups that we belong to. But it continues to be very important. And as was mentioned, the Pew research, most recent research into how Americans get their news, social media is massive. It's incredibly important. And it's not just young people, it's not just people under the age of 40. There's a huge growth in people, 55 and up, who are getting their news through Facebook, through Twitter, through other social media platforms. So that matters too. That matters a lot. So, fake news. In some ways, we can think of it as just a bit of fun, right? Like, oh, I can't believe that silly story about such and such or whatever, or, oh, I can't believe that was wrong. But it can make a difference for individuals, it can make a difference for groups. I'll give you an example. There have been a number of examples that have come to light, but one of them from about 2 or 3 years ago were a couple of teenagers from the Niagara region who had established a website. I won't give the URL because it's dead. It's actually been taken down. But they just started making stuff up, posting news stories and putting them online. And they found they were making money hand over fist because they had advertising on the site. And so they just made up stuff just almost to see how many clicks they could get and how many ads they could get through their sites. They started to hit the wall when they posted a story suggesting that Justin Trudeau beat his wife, Sophie Gregoire. And then suddenly it was brought to their attention that perhaps this was not a harmless enterprise, even though it was making them a lot of money. But they literally, when they were interviewed, they were like, well, we just found it really funny. And we were making money, because they had ads that were being posted there. And when it was brought to their attention, and I think probably, apart from the moral parts of it, also the potential legal ramifications that somebody could charge them for libel, then they kind of shut down. In another case, in the New York Times, they did an expose of somebody who was creating fake news during the election of Trump versus Clinton. And he had written one of the more famous and circulated pieces of fake news about ballot boxes being found. It seemed to suggest that Hillary Clinton and her ilk had tried to sway the election with these ballot boxes that were stuffed and were found. Completely manufactured story. Absolutely, completely manufactured. And in the interview that they did with him, he said, I've got really big tuition bills. Like I have to pay down these bills, and I was making money hand over fist because of Google ads and whatever else. So, I just saw this. And one of the things that came up in both of the interviews was the sense that they weren't hurting anybody, that they weren't doing any damage. And because they were saying, well, we weren't like running a credit card scam. We weren't asking people for their credit cards and taking their money or selling them snake oil or whatever else. So it was a victimless crime was the sense of it. But I'd like to suggest some ways in which I think it's far from a victimless crime. So the first is the obvious one in terms of hurt done potentially to individuals and to groups, and the Justin Trudeau story is a good example of that. The other important part is that when these organizations, these fake websites, fake news writers, when they're receiving advertising money for their work, that's advertising and money that's being taken away from real journalism. Okay, so the kinds of organizations and the kinds of enterprises that we try and see our students go on to work for, the Toronto Stars of the world, the Toronto Suns, the Globe and Mails, the National Post, on and on and on. As you probably have heard, and this morning is unfortunately a very sad example of it, with a lot of local newspapers going to be closing, the advertising dollars that are going towards real journalism are shrinking. And journalists, frankly, the businesses haven't figured out a new business model to make good journalism pay. So every time one of these fake news stories gets out there and gets lots of hits, that's advertising money being taken away from real journalism. So that really upsets me. Very annoying. But I think potentially an even worse harm is how it poisons the well. So this erosion of respect and of faith in news, in journalism, is a real problem. And again, we're seeing that in Technicolor in the US, where people are choosing to watch and to believe things that are sent to them by friends or whatever else, rather than saying, you know what, I read this recently, the Roy Moore story. Steve Bannon was starting off saying, isn't it interesting that it's the Washington Post that brought this? Now, usually, once upon a time, you'd go, wow, the Washington Post, it must be true, right? But in this case, he's saying, Washington Post, which is owned by the guy behind Amazon, and isn't it, so this is becoming this very divisive way of thinking about news, and people just not trusting good journalism. To bring it back home, we saw this most recently here in Toronto with the Rob Ford story. Right? So we had a lot of people who were reading good reporting. Okay, I have to confess some bias here. Robin Doolittle, who was one of the people who did a lot of the reporting on that story, was a former student. She's now at the Globe. But it was very frustrating because they were doing great reporting on the Rob Ford story, and people were just saying, I don't believe you. Show me the crack video. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. And even right to the end, there were supporters of Rob Ford who just said, I just don't believe you because you're the Toronto Star, and you're out to get him. And that was it. There was no way in which one could engage with them. So I think that's a very, very corrosive part of this fake news, which might otherwise look like, small potatoes. But this erosion of trust is a really big deal. So I don't see it as a harmless thing in any respect. So just before I end, and hopefully we'll have lots of good conversations, I want to suggest a couple of ways in which, from a religious point of view, a Christian point of view, a Catholic point of view in this case, we might think about fake news and the way in which one responds to it as a citizen. So the first one is to think about social sin. And in the questions, I've given you a little short summary of the idea of social sin. And this is really important. It's an idea of, especially once you're aware of something, once you've been made aware that there's a problem, that there's a systemic problem, and that it's emphasized, it's influencing the larger society, what is your job in terms of responding to that? Once you know that people are hungry, once you know that people are in trouble, it becomes incumbent upon you to some extent to do something about it, right? And not to partake in something that you already know is happening and is influencing the larger community. So one of the questions that I've suggested we speak about in small groups is about social sin. And it'll be interesting to hear what you think about that. The other one that occurred to me is the idea of scandal. Okay, and this is not the Kerry Washington scandal thing, right? I couldn't watch it all the way to the end, but anyway, it was an interesting thing to be with. So, scandal, I went back, and thank goodness for the web, looked at the Catechism's definition of scandal. So I'll read it to you and you think about it. So, scandal is an attitude or behavior which leads another to do evil. The person who gives scandal becomes his or her neighbor's tempter. He or she damages virtue and integrity. He or she may even draw his or her brother or sister into spiritual death. Scandal is a grave offense if by deed or omission another is deliberately led into a grave offense. Scandal takes on a particular gravity by reason of the authority of those who cause it, or the weakness of those who are scandalized. It prompted our Lord to utter this curse: whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. That also always scared the whatever out of me when I heard that. I remember. Scandal is grave when given by those who by nature or office are obliged to teach and educate others. Jesus reproaches the scribes and Pharisees on this account. He likens them to wolves in sheep's clothing. Scandal can be provoked by laws or institutions, by fashion or opinion. Therefore, they are guilty of scandal who establish laws or social structures leading to the decline of morals and corruption of religious practice, or to social conditions that intentionally or not make Christian conduct and obedience to the commandments difficult and practically impossible. This is also true of business leaders who make rules encouraging fraud, teachers who provoke their children to anger, or manipulators of public opinion who turn it away from moral values. I feel like I should have a highlighter over the top of my head saying, this is the part that's important. Anyone who uses the power at his or her disposal in such a way that it leads others to do wrong becomes guilty of scandal and responsible for the evil that he or she has directly or indirectly encouraged. Temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to him or her by whom they come. That's serious stuff, isn't it? Now, the whole concept of scandal, I think at times, and when I think about it in terms of journalism particularly, I think has been, can I use the word abused? I think particularly of reporting around clerical sexual abuse, and a lot of people saying one of the reasons that it was kept quiet was this invocation of scandal. Let's not talk about this because it's going to scandalize people and they're going to turn away from their religious belief, which was a very, very serious impediment to the truth coming out in that case. But I do think there are ways of thinking about the idea of scandal in terms of this idea of eroding and hollowing out belief in the truth and in good journalism. And that's important. And again, it's a question of, once you know that it's occurring, what is your job in terms of stopping it? And also, what is the responsibility of those who produce the news to not encourage scandal, to not encourage things that are untrue, to go forward and to change and potentially to corrupt people's morals in this respect? The last thing I'd say is to think a little bit, not just about journalists and journalism, but about your part in all of this. So if you recognize something as being fake news, if you recognize something as falling into that kind of category, what is your job? And part of it is not passing it around, not being one of the gazillion people who says, have you seen this story, and hitting like or hitting share, or even clicking on the story, which now, you have to remember that actually is providing income for the person who's creating that news. I think there's, especially with social media, there's this weird detachment at the same time as attachment. So the fact that we have friends and networks with whom we can correspond really easily, but there's also this sense of detachment, like, oh, I'm just retweeting it, or I'm just passing it along. I'm just a conduit. I'm not actually responsible for any of this. Part of it is just self-preservation of your own reputation, right? You don't want to be known as the person who always passes around the fake stories, right? And we become kind of like the boy who cried wolf, like, oh, here comes another thing from Joyce, it's another story about Justin Bieber doing some bizarre thing or whatever else, right? So that's part of it. But part of it also, too, is recognizing how important you as consumers of news are in the entire cycle. And we've seen that with boycotts, more traditional boycotts, when people say, you know what, I'm not going to buy any more Ivanka Trump clothes. I'm just not going to do it. And then suddenly stores are saying, we're not going to carry it anymore. Today I was thinking about South Africa and thinking about the boycotts, no oranges, no South African wine being bought, and that sort of thing. So this market for fake news would, in large part, start to dry up if people weren't clicking on it and they weren't sharing it and there wasn't revenue attached to it. That is one real way, and that you can kind of vote with your mousing finger to decide, I'm not going to support this, even by clicking through on it. If it looks to me like it's fake news that is coming from the wrong sort of source. There are a number of new initiatives out there to try and help consumers recognize what's fake news and what's not. Facebook is one of them. Google, I think Yahoo as well. A lot of attempts, especially to reach younger people, to get them, to recognize if you see a site that's full of misspellings, or take a look at the URL and see where it's actually coming from. Is it The Onion? Have you ever had that? It's happened to me. Have you ever had that experience where you said, oh my goodness, look at this story, and it's actually a satirical story, and then you're like, oh, you kind of missed that, right? So, there's some really good sort of survival tactics that are out there, and there's also an attempt to put in algorithms and other things to kind of detect fake news. But I think it's incumbent upon us as consumers of news to take some responsibility too, and to shut down some of the fake news, and in a more positive, constructive light, support real news, right? Support journalists. Buy a subscription to a newspaper. Or at least buy products from the advertisers and the services who advertise on real news. This matters. We need, yes, I'm biased, but we need journalism more than ever, good journalism.